Yeah, I mean, we can talk about some of those peaking teams first, then, because I think it's interesting to go back in time. I think like a lot of this depends on how much you value the existence of MSI as well, because that was that affects pre 2015 teams like Samsung White. Now, if it had existed, Samsung White still would not have gone to MSI because they were not winning the domestic tournaments. And I think in the context of Samsung White, they are a really fascinating team because by the time we got to Worlds, it was pretty clear. I mean, I predicted before that World started that Samsung White would win Worlds, even though they actually hadn't beaten their sister team, Samsung Blue, in a best of 5 that year. So they had made the finals of the winter season. So after the 2015 SKT Worlds finals, SKT went on their undefeated run through the winter season. They met Samsung, at the time it was called Samsung Ozone, in those finals, 3-0'd them, clapped them. SKT didn't lose a game. Now, the Samsung team started to rise in spring and summer, and in fact, Samsung Blue and White hit each other in the semifinals, both of spring and summer. And we would see Samsung White lose both of those 3-1. And then it was only at Worlds that they looked really dominant compared to the rest of the field. And they actually 3-0'd Samsung Blue in the semifinals of that World. So they overcame their sister team. The thing that's so interesting to me about Samsung White is just the quality of competition that existed in 2014. Like, this was the highest concentration of talent that has probably existed in any domestic region in League of Legends history. Like, every team was so stacked at that time. This was when Rookie was still in Korea. Like, Rookie ended up winning the summer finals.
And
It
not
was
making
before
Worlds because
and
they
not
had
making
probably
world.
one of the worst systems of all time where you could somehow win summer and not make Worlds. Like,
This is the
yeah.
KT condition, Dom. This is the KT condition. It had to happen to KT. Yeah, I mean, it was I mean, Kakao obviously was on that roster as well. Someday was on that roster.
Yep, Hachani.
But this Chani, the goat, the support goat.
Yep.
I mean, the crazy thing is Sachani would actually win another title later. But anyway, this was a concentration of talent that before really any of the players had left Korea. It was before they had gone to NA or Europe. It was before all 10 Samsung players would end up going to China. And so this competition, especially the domestic competitions for Samsung White, was actually significantly harder than Worlds. It was literally much harder to win a tournament, a version of Champions in Korea than it was to win the World Championship at the time, which is why, you could make an argument that they were not, in fact, even as good as Samsung Blue because they were not winning the domestic titles. But the eye test says that this team was like actually insane by the time they reached the World Championship.
What do you think, Dom? What do you remember about this team?
I mean, I remember them being just super good at mid jungle. Like, that was the main thing, or sorry, support jungle. I feel like that was their biggest strength, is they just had like the best support jungle, like dual warding system that pretty much had ever existed at that point. And every single time that they would get some type of lead, the way that they would just create pockets of vision with Mata and Dandy would just make the game so easy for them. Like, they would just create, they would just take all the vision together, and then if anyone checked into that side of the jungle, they'd instantly die and they'd get the objective. And it pretty much revolutionized the way that the game was played. Up until, I mean, even now, that's one of the things that people always are talking about, is syncing your backs with your jungle and support and warding at the same time. So, like, my biggest takeaway was kind of their impact on the game going forward, and like how ahead of, just the game they were to come up with such an effective system at such an early point in League.
Yeah, on that point, actually, I can even remember back in this next year, 2015, people like NukeDoc, like the top EU pros, telling me, like, essentially every single team has copied this jungle support style. Like, it's essentially just like the epiphany on how the game can be played. And every single team in the world just sort of like was like, okay, time to update the playbook. And that essentially became like the meta of how you played the game, I'd say, for a few years, until they fundamentally overhauled the way League worked. So that in itself was massive. Then also you've got to add in, the other thing on this team was, I actually think your angle's quite good there, Monty. In theory, over the year, because they didn't win either as splits, it's debatable if they were even actually the best team of 2014. You could say Samsung Blue was, if you look how excellent they were. Even them, I mean, the joke of worlds, like we've mentioned many times, is for all we know, Samsung Blue was the second best team there, but the bracket meant that they had to, even though they both won their group, they had to go and play against them in the semi-finals. If they'd have played in the finals, maybe they would be second, and then they'd have had a first, a second that year. But this is obviously one of the ultimate eye test teams. Like, if you just look at the actual, like, way they played the game, like, everyone knows why one of the reasons I always roast the fuck out of anyone who was in that TSM is they have the gall to this day to say out loud and expect respect for the following statement: we took a game off. If you've ever watched that game, it's like, bro, they were like, whatever the fucking coach of Samsung was doing, he was in like the fucking Stargate at the end of 2001 on his drafting philosophy. Like, he was just seeing the limits of infinity because they'd smashed them so hard in the previous two games. Like, they were genuinely trying to draft like a super scaling comp, but then go all in at level 1. Like, that's how, like, essentially, if counting that is like if the Washington Generals were like, we almost beat the Globetrotters last time. It's like, that's the fucking game, you idiot. It's rigged. Like, so I can't even believe people bring that one game up, because aside from that game, which even then, by the way, it wasn't just like some awesome game. Aside from that game, they've gorilla monkey stomped this whole fucking tournament. Like, you remember in the final, like, people remember Star and Royal Club won games. It's like no one ever felt when they were winning those games like they might win the whole final. It was almost like, they've got a game. Oh, they got two. What do you know? Like, no one ever really believed this team was going to come on, man.
It was also just in the Samsung White DNA. So this iteration of that roster, like, you would take the results of them losing games a lot less seriously if you had literally watched their entire year, because they would actively troll when they were playing bad teams in Champions. Like, if you were watching group stage matches with Samsung White in spring and summer, they were like a cat playing with its food a lot of the time. They would just draft comps that made no sense when they were very confident. And they would do things like you say in the TSM game, where if they were up 2-0, they would just like send it, is part of their kind of more like carefree identity. And the difference is that when they played Samsung Blue in the next round, they immediately tightened up everything because they had lost to them twice before. And they were like, no rooms for errors. We will just shit stomp these guys. And a lot of the problems, like, one of the weirder things, so I'm also kind of willing to discount in a way the matchup between Blue and White, because they were sister teams and they knew each other so intimately. And you got a lot of weird results in Korea when the sister teams would play each other across all of them, just because a lot of times they were primary scrim partners. And Samsung in particular had actually swapped mid laners between the two teams, so they knew each other even more intimately than most other teams did. They were constantly sharing information with each other about the best way to play the game. But the weirdest factor of those best of fives is that if you go back and watch them, a lot of the time Samsung White is completely dominating early, and then they just throw late. Because Samsung Blue was so good at winning team fights from behind, but it was oftentimes just carelessness that caused Samsung White. So you could see it was like they were just unbridled strength. You could see the potential there. And it was like, if they just fix a couple of things, this team is going to be unbelievably dominant. And by the World Championship, they had.
By the way, along those lines, one of the reasons I always wondered why they potentially had this problem of not winning the splits is, like you say, Monty, the only team that could beat them was their sister team and their practice team, who knows them the best inside out. And that was the one team to beat them. Whereas, the stories, like the stories about this Samsung team is that this Samsung White team was like the greatest scrim team ever by the time that World Championship came. Like, people say not only could you never beat them, but like this is where a lot of those stories I've often referenced come from, where like the joke was, man, Impermatter got so bored of playing scrims and beating people, they do stuff like counter pick themselves and then just shit on you in the lane. Like, I've heard some crazy stuff. So like the joke is, if people know the story, it's happened many times where if a team is too dominant in scrims, sometimes it makes you worse in the official game because you're never getting actually tested. You're never having to fix whatever your flaws are. So I could imagine in the scrim it just ends after 15 minutes because you stomp them.
Dude,
but in the real game, if you have to keep going, maybe you can throw.
I saw those scrims because I was scrimming with CLG with Samsung White right before that World Championship at the end of summer. And I can just tell you that I have never seen a team that was more like ahead of the meta to Dom's point, or like creating the meta, it was honestly at the time very confusing to play against them because of how hard they would clap you. And you would lose so badly that it was difficult to even figure out what you were doing wrong because the answer was everything, right? They were just better than you in every conceivable aspect of the game. And like unwinding that was really, really challenging because they were just conceptually so far ahead. And it really has, what they did in 2014 in terms of that jungle support synergy that Dom refers to is still basically the way the game is played today. Like that was one of the single biggest revolutions in professional metagame in League history. And they were almost entirely responsible for that.
And if anyone goes and watches the GOAT episode, the support and jungle, Mata and Dandy, were people who we had in the conversation for greatest ever at their role. So they also have like the actual players. It's not just like it was. Because there's another thing about this is the problem with accomplishments, by the way, is you'll actually have some teams. It's funny enough, I think some of the SKT ones are going to apply to this. Some of the teams have amazing resumes, but the eye test wasn't as crazy. This one really is, like I say, the eye test for this one tournament is bonkers. Like as long as it has to be under those rules without anything known about League of Legends after that date, I don't know if any team could beat them at that tournament. I don't care what. You could put together any squad from that year, the years before. I don't think anyone could have. They really did look like at that point, they'd almost like solved League at that point in history. So to me, the key thing is, I don't think this is going to be close to my number one because they don't have the rest of the resume and the other tournament stuff. But I do think like they're definitely on the list. Like as soon as I think of greatest teams of all time, there's one of the ones that immediately comes to my mind. What about you, Dom? Where do they fit in the sort of hierarchy for you?
Yeah, I mean, they're a team that you always think about them as like the best team of all time, just because when you rank worlds winners, they had like the best worlds of all time, in my opinion. Like even if you compare it to like, I think last time we had like 2015 SKT, where I think they only dropped like one game the entire tournament or something like that. Yeah. The way that Samsung White won, it just looked like they could never lose. Like it just felt like in every version, like no matter what happened at this World Championship, they were going to be the eventual winners. So I always have them like super fresh in my mind when I have these types of conversations. I just think that like with what we're doing now, we're judging 5-man lineups, and obviously like this lineup was only together for 1 year, and then it all split up and like everyone went to China, essentially, or like most of the players ended up going to China. And the amount of championships they had, I mean, they only had one tournament where they actually were that team. So yeah, and then also I think that the way they played the game was really good, but if you go like player for player, I always thought that like Looper was like pretty fucking sketch. Like this guy, like, I mean, I remember him essentially being like a singed one trick in my mind. That's how I viewed him, as like, oh, he could play singed into like tanks and stuff like that. But I never thought that this guy was actually like a top tier player. Whereas when you look at some other lineups, you can be like, damn, each one of these guys is in competition for best player in the world in their role.
So this is gonna sound strange, but I actually have been on my stream like watching some of the 2013 World Championship again, which featured this roster except with Dade instead of Pawn in the mid lane. And actually, Looper was one of the best. Like this is where the Dade award comes from because he was so terrible at Worlds that year. But honestly, I was surprised to revisit it and see that Looper was actually one of their better players in that year at Worlds.
Where they lost or whatever.
That was the one.
Yeah, when they lost the tiebreaker to Gambit.
And Dandy all shit the bed, if you remember. Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah.
He did all right, though. He was okay.
He was okay, but I agree with you. Like he was definitely, in retrospect, the weakest part of this lineup, but he did have more positive moments than I remembered upon rewatching some of their games.
The way I kind of view it,
money, but I will just throw this out there. The joke on Summoning Insight was he is Mata's third summoner spell as he presses a button and Looper teleports into the bot lane. That was the joke at the time, to be fair,
I would say also like, I mean, the way that I kind of view Looper is like if Doran won Worlds this year. Like that's like how I'd view him, where I'd be like, like he did have good moments. Like he was kind of like clutch in certain aspects, but like you just don't believe he's a good player. Like no matter what, like even if Doran won Worlds and won like two, like it was almost a golden road, whatever, you still would not just be like, oh yeah, Doran's the best top laner in the world. You would just never say that.
No, dude,
I
all
mean,
you need to know is this. The reason why it's a perfect analogy is because, in theory, if Thorin did win both splits of worlds, he should be able to say, I'm the best top laner. But if he said that, everyone would mock him instantly. In the same way as if Looper had said that after worlds. It would be worthy of mockery. I'm sorry, you just weren't, were you, though?
You guys are using Thorin as an example. Have we fucking forgot about Kingen? Like, that just happened last year. He is the Kingen equivalent, basically.
By the way, I'm also just going to put this out there. If we're going to also bring out players that, like, I don't think have aged that well. Bro, one thing that was cancer about this lineup winning is remember how everyone pushed that lineup where, because when he was in blue, Paul had like beaten Faker. And there was that whole thing of like, oh my God, he's better than Faker, isn't he? Like, and then the next year, obviously, he denied Faker that like ever. This was the worst period ever of all the people with no eye test being like, maybe Pawn's just the best mid laner in the whole world. And that angle was pure cancer. I remember it. Again, it's one of those ones that's been put on the shelf, like the whole thing of Bang being the best ADC. No one will ever tell you that opinion, except the Chinese, apparently, on Twitter. But nowadays, you can't find someone who thinks they're the greatest players. But at the time,
isn't one of like the producers like married to Bang? Because I saw a tweet thread about like how Bang deserves more respect, and then I just like looked it up, and it was like, oh, this person is literally just married to Bang. like
it's brilliant. I love it.
Yeah, I was like, where did this come from? Like, who's talking about Bang at this World Championship? Okay. Oh, his wife.
Yeah, yeah. It's she's one of the global producers. She actually produces the English stream for LCK. Yeah, they got married recently.
Yeah,
that's funny.
Well, someone's got to have someone thinks they're the best. So fair play. He's got his wife, and other people have actual players and
Chinese
experts.
social media.
Cool, yeah, and Chinese social media. Exactly. It's quite a hell of a fucking crew he's got going there.
To see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content, well, subscribe to this channel then, or be a pleb and don't.